The breach alarm did not build. It did not escalate. It simply detonated across every speaker on Station Kareth 9 at once, and for 3 full seconds, nobody moved. I remember that, the 3 seconds. 30 Velhari students standing in a corridor outside the Kethara exhibit, and not one of us breathing. Not one of us doing anything useful, just standing there, with our 6 eyes wide, and our secondary membranes flicking up reflexively, because our bodies understood the alarm, even if our minds were still catching up. Then Professor Vethala said, very calmly, "This is a drill." She said it in the voice teachers use when they are absolutely certain it is not a drill. My name is Ori. I am a second-year student at the Galactic Institute of Xenobiological Studies, and I have been studying alien life forms for 2 years, and nothing in 2 years of study prepared me for what happened in that corridor. I have filed the official report. I have answered the questions from the station authority. I have sat in 3 separate debriefs and said the same words in the same order, and watched officials write things down on their tablets. This is not the official report. This is what I remember. We had arrived at the station 6 hours earlier, on a transport from the institute, 30 students and 2 professors, and a very tired administrative assistant named Helb, who had been complaining about his back since the 3rd sector. The station was enormous, the kind of enormous that stops feeling impressive after about 20 minutes, and just starts feeling like a place where you could lose something important and never find it. Research bays on every level, specimen halls stretching long enough that the far end went slightly hazy. Climate zones maintained by sector, so you could walk from a cool corridor into a wall of wet heat and back out again in the space of 100 steps. The station maintained 240 documented species from across the surveyed galaxy. Some of them were passive, and some of them were studied for behavioral patterns, and some of them were here because they were here, because the researchers who had acquired them had needed somewhere to put them, and this was a place. The ethics of that arrangement were the subject of ongoing academic debate that I had strong feelings about, and had written 3 essays on, and which, on the morning of the field trip, felt very relevant in an abstract way that I had no idea was about to become specific. Our tour guide was a Dreth administrator called Processor Quen. Dreth are bureaucratic in the way that gravity is persistent. You do not argue with gravity. You simply accept that it is always present and occasionally inconvenient. Processor Quen had given this tour, he told us, 412 times. He said it without pride. He said it the way you say a number that has stopped meaning anything. We had seen the luminous jellies of Veth. We had seen the stone maws of Kareth Prime, which are exactly as unpleasant as they sound, and slightly more unpleasant than that up close. We had seen the crystalline fungi from Sora 4, and the pack animals from the Deln Expanse, and a small, baffling creature from a water world called a crab that 2 of my classmates refused to stand near because of how it moved. Professor Veth Allah said the crab refusal was scientifically embarrassing. One of the refusing students said it moved wrong. She was not wrong that it moved wrong. It moved like something was counting its legs and losing track in the middle. Then Processor Quen had stopped us outside a sealed corridor and explained the Kethara. He had done it the way you explain a concept that has no frame of reference, not with drama, with data. The Kethara originated in the Selhari Expanse, a region of space that produced predatory species the way some worlds produce storms, constantly and without apology. Of the 17 apex-level species documented in the Expanse, 16 were classified as dangerous. The Kethara was classified as something else. The classification form apparently had a separate category for it. Processor Quen called it non-engagement grade. When a student named Pellin asked what that meant, Processor Quen said that it meant the standard protocol when encountering a Kethara in the wild was to have already not been there. Pellin wrote that down. He wrote everything down. Pellin was the kind of student who wrote everything down with the intensity of someone filing legal evidence, which I had found slightly irritating for the first 6 months of the academic year, and which I had come to understand was just Pellin's way of feeling safe in new situations. The universe made more sense to Pellin when it was on paper. I could not argue with that. The universe mostly made more sense to me when it was in a database, and the difference was only the medium. The exhibit itself was behind 3 redundant force field layers, a reinforced physical barrier rated for impacts that Processor Quen declined to specify in unit terms but described as significant, and a chemical deterrent system that triggered on heat signatures above a certain threshold. The Kethara inside, designation Kethara 7, had been on the station for 14 months. It had never shown interest in the barrier. It had never, as far as anyone could determine, shown interest in anything except the feeding schedule. We pressed against the viewing glass and looked at it. 4 meters, maybe more. The measuring system on the exhibit information panel gave a length, but numbers stopped working when I looked at the actual animal. It was the color of a bruise, deep and dark, and slightly iridescent at the joints, where its exoskeletal plating overlapped. It moved the way water moves. Not like water looks, but like water actually moves, with this absolute disregard for the concept of effort. It crossed the exhibit floor in what seemed like 2 steps, except there were more steps than that, and I lost count trying to track them. Its sensory array, the forward cluster of receptor organs along its head casing, oriented toward the glass, not toward any one of us, toward all of us, the way a compass orients toward north, passive, factual, information gathering. I had read the data on Cathara sensory capacity. It processed heat, vibration, and chemical signals simultaneously, across a range that made concealment from it functionally impossible for most organic species. The data described this. The data did not prepare you for standing close enough to the glass that your breath fogged it, and watching those sensor clusters turn toward you with the unhurried precision of something that had never in its evolutionary history needed to hurry. Pellin stopped writing. My classmate Rill, standing to my left, pressed close enough to the glass that her secondary membranes were almost touching it. She said, very quietly, in the particular register of someone who has just recalculated something, how many of the redundant systems would need to fail. Processor Quinn heard her. He said that the probability of simultaneous failure in all 3 systems was vanishingly small, and that the station had never experienced a containment event of that category. Rill said, of that category. Processor Quinn did not answer that one. We stood there for 4 minutes, which was the allocated time, and then Processor Quinn was already moving us toward the next corridor, and the cephalopod display, and the rest of the scheduled morning. That was when I first saw Yusuf. He was coming the other direction. Maintenance jumpsuit, station issue, the sort of uniform that renders a person invisible inside any large facility, because everyone's eyes slide past it automatically. He had a toolbox in his left hand and something that looked like a diagnostic reader clipped to his belt, and he was walking at the pace of someone who has a specific destination and is not lost, but is also in no particular hurry about getting there. He was human. I had encountered humans 3 times before this, once at the Institute during an open research day when a human xenologist came to give a talk on primate behavioral adaptation, and whose talk I had attended specifically because the Institute's human behavioral module was thin and I wanted supplementary material. Once at a transit station where a human family was waiting for a connecting transport, the small children producing noises and movements that my professors had assured me were normal for the species at that developmental stage, but which I had observed with the alarmed interest of someone watching a life form behave in ways that no taxonomy had quite prepared them for. Once in a documentary on Deathworld ecology that my professor had assigned as supplementary material and that I had watched with all 6 eyes open and had then not slept well for 2 days. What I knew about humans, academically, they evolved on a Class 4 death world, high gravity, high UV exposure, a significant proportion of their native ecosystem capable of harming or killing them. Their evolutionary history was one of persistent, unbroken stress across millions of years, and rather than selecting for species that avoided danger, it had produced a species that engaged with it, adapted to it, and in multiple documented cases, apparently sought it out for reasons that xenobiologists were still actively debating. They were small by galactic standards. They were resilient by any standard. Their pain response was documented, complex, and apparently not always sufficient to stop them from continuing to function through injuries that would incapacitate most species. There was a famous record, often quoted in xenobiological studies, of a human researcher on a survey mission who had sustained a deep laceration from a native fauna encounter, had applied pressure dressing to the wound himself, and had then filed a complete field report covering 3 more hours of observation before reporting the injury to medical staff. The physician who treated him was a Velhari specialist, and her field note on the incident contained 1 sentence beyond the clinical data that had since been cited in 11 separate academic papers. Subject appeared surprised to be told the wound required immediate treatment, as he had considered it manageable. That note, 11 papers, because the most interesting word was surprised. What I registered in that corridor was none of that. What I registered was that Yusuf looked at us briefly, the way you look at a group of students on a field trip, with mild recognition and no particular opinion, and he nodded, and then he kept walking. No fear scent. Every species on our tour group was chemically broadcasting some level of residual unease from the Cathara exhibit. It is involuntary. The body processes what the mind is still rationalizing, and it tells the truth before the mind decides what the truth should be. I could smell my own residual response, faint but present. I could smell Rill's beside me, sharper than mine. The whole group of us was a small chemical weather system of acknowledged threat processing. The human had just walked past a Cathara exhibit, close enough that the chemical deterrent system would have registered his heat signature, and he was broadcasting nothing, not the calm of something that had not noticed. The flat, present, working calm of something that had noticed, and considered, and filed it. I watched him go. He turned the corner at the end of the corridor without looking back. The alarm went off 40 seconds later. Not a rising tone, not a warning sequence. The breach alarm on Station Kareth 9 is a flat, continuous, system-wide note that means exactly one thing, and it means it immediately, and there is no version of hearing it that allows for the possibility that it means something else. Processor Quen's chromatic display shifted 5 shades in under a second, which for a Dreth is the equivalent of every alarm in the building going off simultaneously in visible color. He pulled out his communication device and started talking to someone in rapid administrative shorthand that my translator was struggling with. I caught Sector 9C and non-containment confirmed, and then his voice dropped, and I stopped catching things. My classmate Rill grabbed my arm. Her grip was the grip of someone who had forgotten she was grabbing another person, and was just holding on to the nearest solid object. I looked down the corridor. The Cathara was at the end of it. Not near the end, not approaching. Already there, already present, the way a bad thought is already in your head before you notice it arriving. It had come from the direction of the exhibit hall, which meant it had covered the distance between its containment barrier and this corridor in the time it took us to hear the alarm and register what the alarm meant. The breach alarm that had not yet finished sounding when the Cathara was already standing 40 meters away from 30 Velhari students. The corridor had overhead lighting that turned everything slightly blue. The Cathara in that light looked like something that the universe had designed for a purpose, the way a blade looks like it was designed for a purpose, with no wasted material and no ambiguous angles. Its sensory array was forward, fully oriented, not passive now, active. The difference was visible. I cannot tell you precisely what the visible difference was, because it was not a change in position or size or any measurable physical parameter. It was a change in quality. Something about the way it stood in the corridor with those sensor clusters oriented toward us was different from the way it had stood in its exhibit with those clusters oriented toward the glass. And the difference was the difference between a weather system observed from behind a window and a weather system standing in the room with you. Pellin's notepad hit the floor. I heard it, distinctly. In the silence that had replaced my ability to think, I heard the small flat sound of a notepad hitting a corridor floor, and I remember thinking, with the part of my brain that was still generating thoughts while the rest of it locked, he is going to want that back later. Processor Quen said something. I think it was an instruction. I could not process it. My secondary membranes were fully extended now. Full threat response. Full biological admission that my body had already decided how serious this was, even while my mind was still looking for a way to classify it as manageable. My secondary membranes are supposed to protect my primary eyes. They are a biological reflex, a thin, transparent cover that deploys when light levels change, or when the body identifies extreme threat. I had never had them deploy in response to a living creature before. I had had them deploy once during a lightning event, which is calibrated to light and sound stimulus above a certain threshold. The body knows things. Professor Vethala was moving. She had gotten to the front of the student group and she was directing people toward the emergency branch corridor to the left with controlled insistence, and I watched 2 students respond and the rest of us not responding, standing in our collective biological lockup while the Cathara stood 40 meters away and the alarm kept going. The Cathara took 1 step. Every student in that corridor moved. Not in a coordinated direction, in the 6 directions that 30 individuals move when they all try to move at once. Rill's grip on my arm pulled me sideways. Pellin went forward, and then corrected to backward, and bumped into the student behind him. Professor Vethala was saying something urgent. Processor Quen had stopped talking to his device. The Cathara was not running. It was moving with the same fluid, effortless, unhurried quality it had shown in its exhibit, and it was covering the corridor faster than I could process the rate, because something about its anatomy made the distance it traveled with each movement impossible to calculate correctly until it had already traveled it. 30 meters, 25, 20. In the middle of all of it, from behind the Cathara, from the direction it had come from, someone walked around the corner. Maintenance jumpsuit, toolbox in left hand. Yusuf looked at the corridor. He looked at 30 panicking students. He looked at the Cathara. He put the toolbox down, not dropped, set. He set it down on the floor with the deliberate care of someone who intends to pick it up again and does not want it damaged in the interim. There was something about the specificity of that motion, the conscious placement of the toolbox, that my brain fixed on with the strange, narrow focus that extreme situations sometimes produce. He had not forgotten the toolbox. He had made a small practical decision about the toolbox. Then he straightened up, and he looked at the Cathara, and I watched his face from 40 meters away do something I did not have the biology to fully interpret. My species reads fear in the secondary membranes, in the chromatic response. In the sense signaling, we read calculation in posture and in eye focus, and we read the decision to act in a specific weight transfer that all bipedal species share. I had studied human facial expression. I had attended a seminar on primate affect display. I had read the literature. What I read on Yusuf's face was not any of those things. It was not the studied calm of someone performing composure. It was not the blank absence of someone who had not understood the situation. It was not the wide-eyed, still processing expression of someone encountering something new. It was something specific that I did not have the biology to name, and I have not found the biology to name it since, and I have spent 3 months looking. He took one breath. The slowest breath I have ever seen a living creature take in proximity to a Cathara. The kind of breath that is not about oxygen. The kind of breath that is about a body taking inventory of itself before asking more of it than the inventory would logically permit. Then he reached into his toolbox, which he had just set down, and he took out a wrench. The Cathara's sensory array shifted, from us to him. 15 meters. 10. The Cathara had reduced the corridor between them to 10 meters, and Yusuf had the wrench in his right hand and his left hand loose at his side, and the human said something, out loud, in his own language, which my translator did not catch in real time, but which I later had rendered as, "All right then." That was all. He walked forward. I stopped breathing. The gap between them closed. Both directions at once. 5 meters. Contact. I had read about Cathara predatory mechanics. The primary limbs were the initial engagement tool, and the speed of their deployment was the dominant factor in the Cathara's effectiveness as a predator, because most species' nervous systems could not process the strike before it had already happened, and a species whose nervous system cannot process an event in time to respond to it can only be saved by not being in range when the event occurs. The Cathara struck, and Yusuf was not there. What my eyes told me happened was this. The Cathara's right primary limb moved, and then the corridor was different, and Yusuf was not where he had been. What actually happened took longer to understand because my visual processing, like every Velhari's, is built for a world where the fastest things are mid-speed by galactic standards, and what I saw was not at the correct frame rate for my nervous system. I received the images in the wrong sequence. I received them like a document that has been shuffled, and I spent the next several hours putting the pages back in order in my memory, and I am still not certain I have the order right. He had moved, before the strike landed. Not away, not back, but sideways and low, a motion that had nothing elegant about it, no display quality, no wasted arc, just the purely functional geometry of not being in a specific place at a specific moment. The Cathara's limb hit the corridor wall. The sound was enormous in a contained space. The wall held, because the wall was rated for this, because someone at this station had been thoughtful enough to rate the walls for this, and the Cathara pulled its limb back, and the sensor clusters reoriented. Yusuf came up from the low position with the wrench already moving. It connected with the joint between two sections of exoskeletal plating, a place I would not have known to target without a detailed anatomical study of Cathara joint vulnerability, a study which I had completed 6 weeks before this trip, and which apparently Yusuf had completed through some other means, or had derived in real time. And the sound the connection made was wrong in the way that makes you need to sit down. Not wrong in a bad way. Wrong in the way a sound is wrong when it comes from something that should not be capable of making it. The Cathara's plating was rated, I knew from the exhibit data, to deflect energy weapons at standard grade. The plating was not soft. The plating was the thing that had made the Cathara essentially unkillable by every predator it had ever encountered on its homeworld, and every predator it had ever encountered off it, and the historical record contained no documented case of an organic creature without specialized equipment damaging Cathara exoskeletal plating through direct physical impact. The plating dented. I heard Rill make a sound beside me. It was not a sound I had heard from a Velhari before. It was the sound of a mind trying to fit something into a category it does not fit into. I know that sound now. I have made it many times since that day. It has become one of my most familiar sounds. The Cathara recalibrated. That is the only word I have for what it did. It processed the new information, the information that its first strike had missed, and that something had hit it, and it adjusted. The sensory array narrowed. The body settled slightly lower. It was doing what apex predators do when something unexpected occurs. It was being extremely careful about what happened next. Yusuf did not give it time to finish being careful. He moved again, toward it, into its space, which was not a logical place to go, which was the last place any sensible creature goes when a Cathara is recalibrating, which was exactly where he went, and I watched my translator reach for a word and return nothing useful. The second exchange happened fast enough that I lost parts of it. I know the Cathara struck twice. I know at least one of those strikes connected, because Yusuf went sideways into the corridor wall, with enough force that the sound reached us before his visual reaction did, and the wall paneling cracked along one edge, and 4 of my classmates made the same sound Rill had made, overlapping, a chorus of minds being wrong about what they were watching. He did not go down. He pushed off the wall with his free hand, which meant his ribs had just taken an impact from a Cathara primary limb against a station wall, and he was using the arm on that side to push off with. And either his pain response was not functioning correctly, or it was functioning in a way that did not produce the output you would expect. And I pushed both of those thoughts to the side, because there was more happening. The wrench was still in his hand. And he said something again, untranslated, which my translator later rendered as a term that does not have a direct equivalent, but which carries the emotional weight of deep personal displeasure directed at a specific object or entity. It was short, 1 syllable. He said it with the tone of a being who has decided that a situation is unacceptable and has moved from the phase of tolerating it to the phase of doing something about that. He moved back toward the Cathara. I was not breathing. I had not been breathing for some time. Rill's grip on my arm had become structural. She was not aware she was doing it. I was not aware I was letting her. We were both just holding on to the nearest solid thing while the corridor in front of us rearranged everything we understood about the word predator. The third exchange was different. The Cathara had learned something in the first 2 exchanges. I could see it in the sensory array positioning, which had shifted from the broad passive orientation of information gathering to a narrower, more directed pattern that I recognized from the behavioral literature as target lock. It had identified Yusuf as a specific threat, rather than an incidental variable. It had adjusted its threat assessment. The weight distribution of its body had changed in ways that the literature described as pre-strike optimization. It was serious now. Yusuf was serious now too. I noticed this because the quality of his stillness between movements had changed. He was reading the Cathara, the way I had watched the xenologist on the research day read a behavioral display, with the specific, total attention of someone who is collecting data, and the data is currently the most important thing in the world. His head moved with the Cathara's shifts. His weight moved with them, mirroring at a slight delay. He was not running a conscious analysis. I do not believe his conscious mind was involved in this part. His body was running an analysis that his body had been running since he was small, and his world kept trying to kill things on it. The Cathara struck. Yusuf caught the limb. 2 hands. The wrench set aside for a moment I did not see because the motion was too fast for my eyes at that distance. His hands were on the Cathara's primary limb, both of them, and he was pulling, not away, at an angle, at a specific angle, that correlated to the joint vulnerability I had read about in the anatomical study, and I do not know if he knew the anatomical study, or if he had derived it in the last 30 seconds, and either option produced a conclusion I was not prepared for. The joint gave. Not broke. Gave. The sound it made was the sound of a system failing in a way it was not rated to fail. The Cathara's secondary response was immediate. It pulled back. All of it. A full-body recoil that put it against the opposite corridor wall, and the sensor clusters went to maximum aperture, which in Cathara behavioral literature was the response to genuine threat identification. Not prey identification. Threat identification. The Cathara had reclassified Yusuf, and Yusuf picked up the wrench. I am going to tell you what I was doing during all of this, because I think it is important, and because nobody asked, and therefore I did not include it in the official report. I was standing in the corridor with Ril's hand on my arm, and my secondary membranes were deployed, and my scent signaling was in full threat response mode, and I was watching the human fight the apex predator of the Selhari expanse. And I was angry. Not at the Cathara, not at the situation, at myself. At the fact that 30 Velhari students with 2 years of xenobiological education between them were standing against a wall doing nothing, while one human, in a maintenance jumpsuit, held the corridor. I was angry in the specific way you get angry when you are watching something happen that you are not doing, and you cannot identify a reason why you are not doing it, except that your body has made a decision your mind did not get to vote on. My body had voted, not you. Too big, not equipped. Not built for this. My body was correct. I know my body was correct. Velhari physiology is not built for direct predator engagement. That is simply the truth of what we are and where we came from. Knowing this did not make me less angry. I think that is also important. Station security arrived in the 8th minute. 6 officers with containment equipment, 2 medics, a supervisor who came through the corridor door, saw what was in front of her, and went very still for a moment in the doorway before she started issuing instructions. They had the wide dispersal sedation field equipment, the kind of system that station protocols required for non-engagement grade specimens, the kind that needed 6 trained officers to deploy correctly, the kind that had a field radius and required that no personnel be within that radius when it deployed. Yusuf was within the field radius. He was still moving. The supervisor said something on her communication device. The security team had the field equipment ready, aimed, waiting for a clear deployment window. And there was no clear deployment window because a human maintenance worker was in the corridor, with his hands on a Cathara primary limb. She said something again, louder. I watched her look at the corridor. I watched her make a decision that was not in any protocol I have ever read, because the protocol did not account for what she was looking at. The protocol accounted for evacuation. The protocol accounted for containment team engagement with specified equipment from specified distances. The protocol did not account for a human who had not been briefed on the protocol and was not following it. She said, "Wait." They waited. In the 40 seconds they waited, the corridor sustained 3 more impacts. 2 of them were Cathara strikes that went wide or were deflected. One of them was Yusuf, driving the Cathara backward with both hands on the compromised joint, using the anatomy that was failing as the point of leverage, and the Cathara going back 2 full steps under that pressure, which the anatomical literature did not describe as possible from an external force of this scale, and which happened anyway. Then Yusuf was clear. He had moved out of the field radius without anyone telling him to. I do not know if he had known about the field radius and had been managing his position relative to it the whole time. I do not know if he had simply done the thing that seemed necessary and happened to be clear at the right moment. I do not know which of those options is more remarkable. The supervisor deployed the sedation field. The Cathara went down. Not all at once. Not like something broken. Like a building settling, each section finding the floor progressively, from the limbs inward, until the whole enormous mass of it was still, and the corridor was just a corridor again, except for the wall paneling damage, and the 2 cracked plating sections on the Cathara's carapace, and the particular quality of silence that follows something too large to process. The alarm stopped. I did not know when it had stopped. I noticed the silence now, and the silence was its own kind of information. The information that it was over, that the corridor was just a corridor, that 30 Velhari students were standing against a wall, all still holding on to the nearest solid thing. I noticed that my secondary membranes were still deployed. I put them down deliberately, the way you put down something you picked up for a reason, and the reason is gone. They went down slowly, because my body was not convinced. Yusuf was sitting on the floor beside his toolbox. He had found the nutrition bar in his breast pocket. He was eating it with the expression of a man taking a break, not performing calm, not trying to look unbothered. Actually, biologically, in his body, taking a break and eating a nutrition bar. The medics moved toward him. He looked up at them. He said something I could not hear at this distance. They stopped. One of them said something back. He shook his head, and he took another bite of the nutrition bar, and I watched the medic try once more, and he looked at her, and she did not continue forward. I stood there. Rill's hand was still on my arm. The supervisor was issuing instructions to the security team. Processor Quen was talking to his supervisor on his communication device, and I could hear from here that he was using administrative shorthand that had gone about 4 levels above formal. Professor Vethala was doing a count of students, moving down the group, touching each of us lightly on the shoulder, in the Velhari way of confirming presence, making sure everyone was here, and upright, and accounted for. She touched my shoulder. I barely felt it. I let go of Rill's hand. I walked toward the human. Behind me, I heard Professor Vethala say my name in the specific tone she used for students who were making choices that were going to be discussed at length later. And I kept walking, because there was something I needed to know right now, in this corridor, before the medics got to him, and the security team finished the containment, and the station authority arrived, and everything got processed into official language. I stopped 3 meters from him. He looked up at me. He chewed. He was unhurried about the chewing. He waited. My translator was ready. My voice was not quite ready, but I used it anyway, because readiness was not going to improve by waiting. "Were you frightened?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment, the way someone looks at a question they are deciding to take seriously, which is a different look from the way someone looks at a question they have already answered and are now waiting for you to catch up. He was thinking about it. He was actually considering whether the answer was yes. He chewed. He thought about it. "Little bit, yeah," he said. My translator returned this correctly. Every word came back in precise Velhari. The words were not complicated. The concept they described was, in fact, the most complicated thing anyone had said to me in 2 years of education, and it arrived in my chest like a stone being dropped into deep water. Small entry, no splash, and then the rings spreading outward and not stopping. I said, "A little bit." He said, "Little bit, yeah. The Cathara thing was, he considered. It's a big animal." He said the last sentence with the tone of a being acknowledging a relevant fact. The Cathara was a big animal. This was true. This was a thing that was worth noting. "But you still," I started. He looked at me. He waited. I did not have the sentence. I had the shape of it, the architecture of what I was trying to ask, but the words were not there, because the thing I was trying to ask was built on a framework my language did not have. My species defines courage as the suppression of the fear response, the absence of the fear signal. We honor stillness in the face of threat, because stillness is what we can achieve, the highest biological output our bodies allow, when everything in them is screaming to collapse or flee. A Velhari who does not flinch is a Velhari to be respected. We have poetry about this. We have historical figures defined by this. The whole architecture of what we call bravery is built on the absence of the thing that fear does to a body. This human had just described experiencing that thing, casually, as a small, accurate measurement. A little bit, yeah. He had felt it, and his body had done what fear does, and he had then walked toward a Cathara with a wrench and done what I had spent the last 9 minutes watching him do. Not despite the fear. With it. The distinction sat in my chest like something structural. I said, "The students were behind you." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Is that why?" He looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone receiving a question they have not previously considered as a question. because the answer has always been too obvious to constitute a choice. I mean, he said. Yeah. He finished the nutrition bar. He folded the wrapper and put it in his pocket, and then he looked around at the security team and the medics and the supervisor and the 30 Velhari students all looking at him, and he said something to the nearest medic that my translator caught, as asking whether everyone was all right. Not himself. The students. The medics said they were. He nodded, satisfied, and he allowed the medics to look at him, but only when they agreed to do it there in the corridor, and not somewhere else, because he wanted to make sure the recontainment was completed first, and he said so plainly. The supervisor confirmed recontainment, and he let the medics approach, and he sat on the floor and ate the last corner of the nutrition bar and let them do their work. I went back to my group. Professor Veth Allah was waiting, with the expression of an academic who has decided to defer the conversation until later, because later cannot come fast enough, and also because she had a student count to complete, and professional priorities to maintain, even when the corridor looked like this. I let her touch my shoulder again on the second pass of the count. I was present. I was also somewhere else, entirely. 37 days after the incident on Station Kareth 9, I submitted a formal research proposal to the Institute. My advisor, Professor Darren Vo, read it in the meeting, and then set it down, and looked at me over the top of it, with the expression he used when a student had done something he considered promising, but inconvenient. The proposal was titled, Threat Calculation Architecture in Deathworld Origin Species, a reframing of the Velhari Courage Model. He said the title was too long. I said it was the minimum number of words required to contain the argument without losing something important. He said that was a very student thing to say. I said I was a student. He approved it, with revisions. The revisions were primarily about the scope in the opening section, which I had written at approximately 3 in the morning, following a week of not sleeping well, and which read, according to him, as less of an academic argument and more of a personal confession. I accepted the revisions. I also kept the draft with the personal confession in it, because it was accurate, and because sometimes the first version of a thing is the most honest version of a thing, even if it is not the most useful version. What the proposal argued, in the formal version, the Velhari model of courage is defined by the suppression of the fear response, and this model is built on a specific evolutionary pressure, unique to our homeworld, and when applied universally, as a framework for understanding courage across all species, it produces significant errors in analysis. And the human species in particular represents a category of being whose courage response cannot be understood within the Velhari model, and requires a separate framework entirely. What the first draft said, at 3 in the morning, we have been studying the wrong thing. We have been measuring absence when we should have been measuring conversion. My advisor's revision changed that to, current analytical frameworks may be insufficient to capture the full range of courage-adjacent behavioral responses observed in Deathworld origin species. Same thing, more words, easier to publish. I do not resent the revision. I understand what it does. It makes the argument accessible to people who are not ready for the 3 in the morning version. I went back to Station Kareth 9, 3 months after the incident. My advisor approved the independent research visit, with the expression of someone who was not entirely sure they should be approving it, but could not find a strong enough counter-argument. I went with a formal research credential, and a list of questions and the specific intention of speaking to the human maintenance worker named Yusuf, who had been in the corridor. He was at his preferred table in the station's common area when I found him. He had, a staff member had told me, a specific table he used when his shift break aligned with the lunch period, a table near the wall on the left side with the view of the main corridor, and I had been told this in the tone of mild amusement that suggested it was a known fact about him, the kind of known fact that accumulates around a person who has been somewhere long enough to have habits. He looked up when I approached. He recognized me. There was a brief, considering pause while he placed me, the 6 eyes being the distinguishing feature of Velhari, and then he said, "The student, from the corridor." "Yes," I said. "My name is Ori." He said his name was Yusuf, which I already knew, and he indicated the other side of the table, and I sat down. He was eating. He ate with the efficiency of someone who considers eating a task to be completed, rather than an experience to be extended, which is a thing I had read about humans, and which proved true in this specific case. He ate while we talked, and it did not interfere with either activity. I had the questions in order. I had prepared them carefully. I asked the first one, which was about his background and training, because that was where any reasonable analysis had to start, with the biography, with the data. He told me he grew up on a cattle ranch in Texas. The word Texas, my translator returned as a proper noun without cultural content attached, and I made a note to research Texas specifically, which I subsequently did, and which added several new data points to my proposals section on human baseline threat environments. He said he had been in the Merchant Marine for 12 years before transitioning to station maintenance work, and that station maintenance paid better and kept him in one place, which he had reached an age where he appreciated. I asked about the 12 years in the Merchant Marine, because that was a significant period of time in an environment with documented occupational hazards, and he described several of them with the casual accuracy of someone recounting weather, and I took notes, and the notes did not fully convey the tone, which was the tone of, "These things happened, I managed them, they were not remarkable." Not performed equanimity, actual equanimity. I asked him, "When you were in the corridor, when you saw the Kethara, what did you think?" He was quiet for a moment, chewing. "I thought it was heading toward the kids," he said. I said, "And then?" He looked at me, "And then I needed to change that." I said, "That was the whole calculation?" He said, Yeah. I looked at my list of questions. Question 3 was about decision-making under stress, which was meant to be the entry point for a discussion of the physiological response, the fear response, the conversion process that I was trying to understand. I moved to question 3. Were there other options you considered? I asked. Running, finding cover, waiting for security. He thought about it genuinely. He was not dismissive of the question. He turned it over. "Sure," he said. "Those were options. But you didn't take them." "No." "Why not?" He picked up his food container, found it empty, set it back down. He looked at the table for a moment, in the way that means someone is trying to articulate something they have not previously had to put into words. "Because the kids were right there," he said. "If I'd run, the thing follows movement, right? And if it follows me out, fine. That's a different problem. But if it didn't follow me, if it went toward them instead, then I ran, and they didn't." He said this without drama, without weight, as a simple logical sequence. I wrote it down. Then I stopped writing, and I just looked at what I had written, because the simple logical sequence was the most remarkable thing I had heard since, "Little bit, yeah," said. "You calculated the possibility that fleeing might result in harm to the students, and that calculation changed your decision." He said, "That's one way to put it." I said, "How would you put it?" He said, "I couldn't run. They were right there. The difference between those two sentences is the thing I have been trying to articulate for 3 months, and I am getting closer. My version: cognitive analysis, threat calculation, variables weighed, decision made. His version: no decision, impossibility. He could not run, not would not, could not. The students being there made flight a thing that his biology did not present as an available option, and I do not think this is metaphor or rhetorical softening. I think it is an accurate description of what happened in his nervous system when he assessed the corridor and the students and the Kethara. The option of leaving was not heavily weighted against and rejected. It was absent. I asked, "Is this something humans experience generally, or is it specific to you?" He thought about it. "I think most people would do the same thing," he said. He paused. "Most people I know." I did not ask him to expand on the qualifier. I noticed it. I asked, "Have you done something like this before?" He said yes. He described the steer. He was 14. His younger brother was smaller and slower. The steer came through the fence at a bad angle, and he got between them. He allowed, with a slight smile, that a steer was not a Kethara, that the comparison was not perfect. I said the geometry seemed similar. He looked at me. "Yeah," he said, "the geometry's the same." I asked him if he had been afraid of the steer. He thought about it. "Probably," he said. "I don't remember being afraid. I remember the steer being loud and large and moving fast. I remember my brother being behind me. And you were 14, I said. 13, he corrected. I think I was 13. 13. A human at 13 years of age, which is early in their developmental cycle, which is before the full completion of their neurological maturation, had made the same calculation, had been physically incapable of running while a sibling was behind him, had placed himself between the threat and the smaller being. I looked at my notes. I thought about the curriculum. The Institute's module on humans was 3 lectures and an optional seminar. The 3 lectures covered physiology, evolutionary history, and a condensed behavioral overview. The behavioral overview spent 4 slides on the courage response and described it as an adaptive stress reaction producing enhanced physical output, associated with neurological changes that temporarily alter threat perception. 4 slides. Temporarily alter threat perception. I sat in the common area of Station Kareth 9, and I thought about 4 slides, and I thought about temporarily alter threat perception, and I thought about a 13-year-old human standing between a steer and his brother because his body did not offer him the option of not doing that. And I thought about a 30-something human setting down a toolbox in a corridor because the students were right there, and I thought about, little bit, yeah, and I thought about the gap between 4 slides and what I had watched. The gap was the whole story. We had been studying the wrong thing. We had taken the visible output, the physical performance in crisis, the enhanced capacity, the continued function through injury, all the things that looked dramatic from the outside, and we had documented those. We had measured what humans could do when the fear came. We had not asked what the fear was doing inside them. We had not asked why it did not make them smaller. We had not asked about the geometry. I thanked him for his time. He said it was no problem, genuinely, in the way that means it genuinely was no problem, and not in the way that means it was a problem being politely managed. I was almost to the corridor exit when he said my name, or tried to. Velhari names are not always accessible to human vocal anatomy. He made a reasonable attempt. I turned. He said, "The students, from the tour group. They were all okay?" He was asking 3 months later. It had not been in the 40 seconds. It was here, at a lunch table, 3 months later. I said they were. I said everyone was fine. No physical harm to any student. He nodded. He picked up his now empty food container, presumably to dispose of it properly. "Good," he said. He said it the way you say a thing when it is the only thing that actually mattered. I stood in the corridor outside the common area for a moment, before I continued to my next appointment. The station was busy around me, the ordinary busyness of a research facility in the middle of a working day, maintenance crews and research staff and transport schedules, and the low hum of climate systems doing their work. Good. The whole event, for him, resolved to that. The students were fine. Good. Next. I have a theory about this, and I want to put it in the proposal, and my advisor has not yet seen the section because I am still writing it, and I expect he will want revisions, and I am going to argue for them in this case, with more energy than I argued for the title. The theory is, humans do not process the aftermath of courage the way we process it because they are not performing courage. They are not performing anything. They are responding to a geometry, and when the geometry resolves, it resolves. The threat is contained. The students are fine. The Kethara is sedated. There is no performance to conclude, no emotional arc to close, because there was no performance. We watch humans in these events and we see heroism, because that is our category for it. We see something extraordinary. We see a narrative. They see a geometry. They see students, threat, position, response. And then, students, fine. Good. I went to the exhibit hall after I left the common area. I was not scheduled to be there. I had no research purpose there. I went because I needed to stand in front of the thing and look at it again. Kethara 7 was in its containment, restored to full protocols, moving across the exhibit floor with the same fluid, unhurried grace. The plating sections that had been cracked were substantially regenerated. In 3 more months they would be indistinguishable from the undamaged sections. The joint that had been compromised under human grip pressure was functional, moving with only a slight variation in the range that a non-specialist would not notice. I stood at the glass. The sensory array oriented toward me. I thought about the corridor. about what it had looked like when the Cathara was at the end of it, and the alarm was still going, and 30 students were against the wall. About what it had looked like when Yusuf put his toolbox down. I thought about the gap in our curriculum. The gap is not about data. We have data. We have extensive data on human physiology, human evolutionary history, human documented performance in crisis situations. The data is there. The gap is about what we ask the data to mean. We have been asking the data to mean, humans are exceptionally capable under stress. We should have been asking the data to mean, humans experience fear, and fear does not make them smaller. We should have been asking, why not? And the answer, which I do not have the full shape of yet, which I am spending this year trying to build, is something about what their world made of them. Something about millions of years of a world that killed things, and the particular shape of what it built, instead of killing them. Something about a nervous system that evolved in a place where the thing chasing you was not always slower than you, and not always smaller than you. And so your survival could not always be about being faster, or about hiding. And sometimes, it had to be about standing between the thing and the thing behind you, and making the calculation come out differently than it should. Something about what that pressure, maintained long enough, does to the geometry. Velhari evolved on a world of moderate pressure. Our survival strategies are avoidance, community, intelligence, and the application of those things to the management of a manageable environment. We are not built for corridors with Cathara in them. We are not built to make that calculation and find flight absent from the list of options. We are built to be the 30 students against the wall. And I want to say clearly, in my proposal, in the version my advisor will want to revise, there is nothing wrong with being the 30 students against the wall. This is what survival looks like for a species from our world. This is correct. This is the right output of the right evolutionary pressure over the right period of time. But it is not the only answer to the question. And the other answer, the one I watched in that corridor, the one that is sitting on the floor eating a nutrition bar while the medics approach, the one that is checking on the students first and himself second, the one that 3 months later still just wants to know if everyone was okay, good, next. We do not have a word for that. We do not have a framework for it. And I think that is something we should find troubling. Because the galaxy is large, and it contains Cathara, and it contains corridors, and it contains students who cannot run fast enough. And somewhere in the taxonomy of responses to all of that, the response we are missing, the one we do not teach because we do not have a language for it, is the most important one. I stood at the glass until the alarm on my research schedule reminded me that I had a transport to catch. I looked at the Cathara one more time. It looked back at me through the sensory array, the same way it had looked at me the first time, passive and factual and unbothered. I thought, Yusuf had a different opinion about you. Then I went to catch my transport. The official incident report is on file with the Station Authority, the Institute, and the Galactic Registry of Significant Fauna Events, where it has been assigned a case number and a classification, and presumably sits in a database next to other case numbers and other classifications, properly organized, properly labeled, properly insufficient. The report is 17 pages. It took me 6 days to write. It is, I genuinely believe, the most precisely worded document I have ever produced. Every measurement is verified. Every timeline is accurate. Every observation is rendered in clinical language that communicates the event without communicating what the event meant. I am a second-year student. The clinical language is what I have. The clinical language is the best tool my training has given me for events that exceed the ordinary, and I used every part of it, and the 17 pages are correct, and if you read them you will know what happened in that corridor, and you will not know what happened in that corridor. This is the thing I could not put in the official report. Not because it was not true, because the fields on the report form did not include a field for it. There is a field for incident description. There is a field for containment outcome. There is a field for personnel involved. There is a field for specimen condition post-incident. There is a field for additional observations of xenobiological significance. I used that last field. I wrote 12 words in it. Further study of the human species is recommended. Current frameworks are insufficient. My pen was on the delete key for a long time. I left it in, because those 12 words are the minimum true thing, and minimum true is better than nothing, and I wanted someone with more institutional authority than a second-year student to read them and feel the pull of the gap between minimum true and fully true. I want them to ask, insufficient how? And I want to be ready when they do. The proposal is 40 pages now. It will probably be longer before I am done with it. My advisor says the scope is ambitious for a second-year research project. I said I was aware. He said the preliminary findings were interesting. I said I was aware of that too. The seminar I missed in first year, the Human Behavioral Module seminar, that I skipped for the Advanced Cephalopod Cognition course, is running again in the spring. I have registered. Not because I think it will be sufficient. I already know it will not be sufficient. I registered because I want to sit in that room and listen to whatever 40-minute overview they give of the human courage response. And I want to sit with everything I know now that I did not know then. And I want to identify every place where the framework is wrong. I want to make a list. I think the list will be useful. I think the list will be the beginning of the framework we do not have yet. The one we need. The one that can hold the thing I watched in that corridor and name it accurately. Not courage as absence. Not courage as suppression. Something else. Something that starts with fear and converts it. Something that reads the geometry and does not find flight on the list of options when the students are behind you. Something that 3 months later just wants to know if everyone was okay. Good. Something that says, good. And then goes back to the maintenance schedule. I have been thinking, since the station visit, about something one of my classmates said on the transport back after the incident. It was not Pellin, who was writing in his notepad with the intensity of someone catching a signal before it fades. It was not Rill, who did not speak for 2 hours. It was a student named Caver, who sat 2 rows back from me, and who had not previously been someone I thought of as philosophically oriented, and who said, to no one in particular, looking out the transport window, I want to know what it felt like. Not, I want to know how he did it. Not, I want to know why he didn't run. Not any of the questions I was running in my head. The analytical questions. The academic questions. I want to know what it felt like. I think about that. I think I have been approaching this from the outside, from the observable data, from the behavioral outputs, because that is the methodology I was taught, and because the observable data is remarkable enough that it has occupied most of my analytical capacity for 3 months. But Caver was not asking about the data. Caver was asking about the inside of it. The experience. What does it feel like to be a body that does not give you the option of leaving? What does it feel like to have a geometry instead of a choice? What does it feel like to be afraid? A little bit. And to have that fear do nothing to the list of available actions. I do not have access to that. I am Velhari. My body makes fear loud in a way that is appropriate for my world, and my courage is built on the discipline of making it quieter, and that is all I have, and it is good, and it is mine, and it is not what I watched in that corridor. I cannot feel it from the inside, but I can describe it from the outside better than the current literature does, and I am going to, and it is going to take longer than a second-year research project probably should, and my advisor is going to want revisions, and I am going to argue for most of them, and the final version will be cleaner than what I have now, and the clean version will be what gets published, and somewhere in the gap between the clean version and the 3 in the morning version is the thing I am actually trying to say, which is this. We thought we understood what the Cathara was. We had data. We had a classification. We had a category called non-engagement grade that the whole galaxy agreed on, and the reason the whole galaxy agreed was because the whole galaxy's species had looked at the same data and run the same threat calculation and arrived at the same place. Yusuf ran a different calculation, not because his data was different, because the terms in his equation were weighted differently. Because one of his terms was the students, and that term was weighted in a way that no analytical framework currently in use was built to account for, and I am going to build that framework, and I am going to call it something that my advisor will want to change the title of, and I am going to argue for the title, and the title will be something about geometry. Something about how the same corridor looks different depending on what is behind you. Something about how the question, what else are you going to do, has different answers depending on which world you came from. I have been to the exhibit hall 3 times since my return from the station visit. My research schedule does not require it. I go anyway. I stand at the glass and I look at the Cathara, and I think about the corridor, and I think about the toolbox being set down, and I think about the wrench, and I think about the specific quality of that breath before he walked forward. The slowest breath I have ever seen. Not slow because he was not afraid. Slow because he was getting ready. Getting ready is not the same as not being afraid. Getting ready is what you do with the fear. You take the fear, and you take the adrenaline the fear produces, and you take the sharpened perception, and the enhanced output, and the narrowed focus, and you use it, and the only difference between a being that uses it and a being that it uses is the question of whose body it belongs to. Yusuf's fear belonged to Yusuf. He spent it the way he chose, on the Kethara, because the students were right there. The proposal will be done by the end of the semester. I know this because I have told my advisor it will be done by the end of the semester, and I have learned that the sentences you say out loud to advisors have a way of becoming true, in ways that sentences you only think to yourself do not. At the bottom of the official report, in the field for additional observations, 12 words. Further study of the human species is recommended. Current frameworks are insufficient. I want someone to ask me how insufficient. I want to tell them, more than the report contains, more than 4 slides, more than 3 lectures, and an optional seminar that I skipped for cephalopod cognition, which I do not regret, and which I would skip again, but which I now understand was not the highest priority question my education was failing to answer. I want to tell them about the 3 seconds, about the 30 students not breathing, about the way 30 Velhari bodies, 2 years into an advanced degree, correctly identified the threat, and correctly determined that the threat exceeded our capacity, and correctly calculated that the right response was to stay very still and hope that the thing at the end of the corridor oriented towards something else. And about what happened at the end of those 3 seconds, when something walked around the corner in a maintenance jumpsuit and set a toolbox down and walked forward. And about what the word yet means in the sentence, we do not yet have a word for this. Yet. I put that word in the report, in the 12 words, in the field for additional observations. Yet. It is the most important word in the 12. It is the word that says, we are going to build this. We do not have the language, but we are going to build it, and it is going to take longer than 1 second-year research proposal. But we are going to start here, in this field, with these 12 words, and the gap between minimum true and fully true is where the work is. The gap is where I am. The gap is where I am going to stay until I have something to say about the geometry. Until I can explain, in language that the whole galaxy can read, what it looks like when fear does not make something smaller. What it looks like when something takes the fear, the little bit of it, the appropriate amount that any sensible being would have in that corridor, and instead of being used by it, uses it. What it looks like from the outside. What it means from the inside. What Caver meant when he said, I want to know what it felt like. I want to know too. I am going to spend a long time learning. The Kethara at the glass looks back at me. The sensor clusters are passive now. Factual. Information gathering. I wonder if it remembers. I wonder what it processed. In the moment when the grip closed on the compromised joint. In the moment when its threat classification adjusted from prey and corridor to something else. Something the galactic literature had not previously given it cause to classify. I wonder what category it filed Yusuf in. I think I know. I think it filed him the same category I am still building a name for. Something that the geometry did not predict. Something that came from behind the alarm, in a maintenance jumpsuit, with a toolbox and a wrench and a little bit of fear, and asked the corridor a very simple question. What else are you going to do? And then answered it.